Hello, everybody. Welcome to Momentum Boost. I am your host, Adrienne Gold Davis, and I feel truly grateful that you're joining us today because, after all, it's September 11th. So, if you want to ask our guest a question, you just click that question mark that's in the lower left-hand side of the chat box. And all questions here are visible to everybody. So, if you needed to ask anonymously, you just click the hand icon. So, the Hebrew word for remember is zachor, and it's repeated nearly 200 times in the Hebrew Bible. The commandment to remember has been central to the survival of the Jews, and it's also the key in attempting to avoid the inevitability of history repeating itself. Today is September 11th, as I said, and as Jews, it's vital that we remember. But remembering an event is more difficult than remembering a person. And when you make things personal, when we remember the soul of their dear departed, we can opt to emulate their greatness, to emulate their greatest character strength. And in doing so, that's how we keep them alive. So today, our guest has devoted much of his post 9/11 life to remembering and emulating the bravery and impact of Daniel Lewin, who was the first casualty of September 11th. Danny was that man who stood up in the first plane to hit the Twin Towers and attempted to take on the hijackers. He was killed instantly. Danny was also the dear, dear friend and mentor to our guest today, whose name is Marco Greenberg. Marco's going to share his memories and concurrent inspiration from this hero so that we might all learn and grow in his merit. So Marco Greenberg is the president and co-founder of Thunder One, a strategic communications boutique, and he's the author of Primitive, Tapping the Primitive Drive that powers the world's most successful people. He previously served in the Israeli Defense Forces Spokesman's Unit, and I'd like you to help me welcome Marco.
Adrienne, thank you for that moving introduction. It's truly a pleasure to join you and the viewers of Momentum Boost on this historic day. Unfortunately, we have a lot of other distractions in the world today that prevent a lot of us from remembering, but remember we must. And for me, that starts with the story of Daniel Lewin. I met Danny when he was 16 years old in the summer of 1986 in Jerusalem, apropos of someone who was very much a biblical character, and that's who Danny was. He was lifting a huge amount of weight, incredibly gregarious, incredibly intelligent, outgoing, a social animal before we use that term. And we immediately connected. I was going to Hebrew University summer school. I was joined by my sister, Laura, who I think is joining us as one of the viewers today. And we immediately saw that Danny was an extraordinary individual. Before we talk about 9/11, just in terms of background, he was someone who I have said many times is the most formidable person I've ever had the privilege of meeting in my life. He was not just a huge, towering intellect who developed with his professor at MIT many of the algorithms that allow us to have this interaction via web video today.
Right.
But he was also someone who was physically incredibly brave and imposing. His hands were more like mitts. He was very fond of giving high fives and big hugs. He was effusive in his praise for those he loved. And in return, so many countless loved him, but not just intellectually and physically, also spiritually. Danny's connection to the land of Israel was profound. Obviously, he was very proud to be an Israeli American or an American Israeli. He made Aliyah with his family in 1984 when he was 14. And originally it was a tough adjustment. This was Israel before Startup Nation. This was Israel with one television channel, maybe included that would come from Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt. And he was a remarkable figure. The fact that he was the first person, not killed, not someone who passed away, but as his mother, Peggy, in Jerusalem, a practicing pediatrician, corrected me in saying, Danny was not killed or he didn't die, he was murdered. And he was murdered on Flight 11, standing up against the terrorists, including the ringleader, Mohammed Atta. So again, we're talking about an extraordinary individual.
Something. Hold on.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, you said his mother corrected you and said that he was murdered, not killed. And I was thinking actually that the language that we use in remembering people can often be manipulated to sort of soften the blow. Like when somebody dies, we say they passed on, or they left us, or, they've moved on to another something. Why do you suppose we do that? Why do you suppose that when it comes to grief, what have you discovered in your grieving over the last decade and more makes us not want to remember realistically?
That's a powerful question. And I think, including people in our own faith, and certainly people of all faiths, have difficulty in dealing with their own mortality. And many of those reasons are very understandable. But Danny was also someone that pushed himself and others out of their comfort zone. He was someone who had zero tolerance for hypocrisy, for pretentiousness, for doublespeak. He was both loving and respectful, but incredibly direct. So Danny would bristle at the notion of calling 9/11 the events of 9/11, as if it's some kind of TV miniseries. Danny would call it what it was, an unprecedented attack on American soil. And so I think that candor is something that certainly he had innately, but it was also shaped by his time in Israel. Some might know the name of the company that he co-founded with his MIT professor, Tom Layton, and two other co-founders, Jonathan Seelig and Randall Kaplan. But not everyone realizes that Akamai Technologies is responsible for delivering a third of all content on the internet today. Really? So Danny's inventions are more relevant now than ever. But again, to be with someone, I just want to share an anecdote of what it was like to be with Danny, because I made Aliyah in the end of 1993. And in 1994, Danny was wearing many different hats. Okay. If you can believe it, he was both the father with his wife Ann to a young son. So changing diapers and doing it with relish and enjoyment. He was a stellar student at the Technion, majoring in mathematics, computer science, electrical engineering. He was doing his reserve duty in Sayeret Matkal, the most elite commando unit in the IDF. He would be correcting papers as we had dinner at his apartment in Haifa, looking at mistakes in math that other very bright students had made, and arguing about politics all at the same time. Wow. So, he was truly a Renaissance soul, and the kind of person you don't see come around that much. I mean, I used to tell him, look, you're either going to be the next prime minister of Israel or the next Bill Gates or both. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, do you think that part of the reason that you've spent so much time remembering not just your personal loss, but the collective loss of the world is because he was so filled with potential? I mean, what I'm trying to understand is it's a tragic, horrible story, and so much about his character clearly was forged much earlier on. And I would imagine that because of that, his reaction to standing up to those terrorists on that flight was innate and trained into him and so on. But you, Marco, you have made your life's work part of it to keep him alive and remember him. How did you feel? I mean, you knew all of his potential before. When he died, when he was murdered, as his mother said, what was it in his character that you felt was so important to remember and to keep alive?
Danny bestowed upon all of us many, many gifts, gifts of character, gifts of connection to Israel, our faith, fun. He enriched all of us in every way, and including in a monetary way. So I and others feel a debt to keep his memory alive. Why? In part, he would want it that way. Yes, he exhibited humility, the kind of humility that let him sweep the floors of Samson's gym in Jerusalem when I met him when he was 16, but also sweep the floors of MIT graduate housing with his wife and 2 young boys back in 1996 and 97. But he also was confident that what he was onto would have big repercussions. He used to joke that the internet should be called not the www dot, but rather the World Wide Wait. And his big, hairy, audacious goal was to end those delays and herky-jerky movements. And yes, we had a few little technical difficulties early on.
It was Danny.
Now Danny fixed all of those. We're running smooth. You know, it's yes, because of what he would want, but it's also an obligation that we should all know and take very seriously. I'm zooming in through, if that's the platform we're using, through Western Massachusetts in Great Barrington, Mass. I split my time between the Upper West Side of New York City and Western Massachusetts. And I was looking through the local paper, the Berkshire Eagle, today. Okay, this is a paper that has a very illustrious history. Unfortunately, and I scanned it back forwards many times, there's not one reference to 9/11 today on the 19th anniversary of 9/11. So I think this is also a collective history lesson for the world to not forget and to put a human face on this tragedy. And I can think of no other loss that we've experienced that has been as devastating as losing Danny, 31 years old, at the height of his career. He would have founded other companies that would have been household names. If I would compare him to people today, it would be like, you know, Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and again, Bill Gates wrapped into one with Israeli commando on top. So we're talking about someone truly extraordinary. I would say that no one knows what it's like to lose someone like him more than his immediate family. And I can't to this day comprehend the pain that they have undergone and are undergoing. I'm one step removed as a close friend, so I do feel that's an added obligation to keep his name alive, but I'm certainly not alone in that. There are many organizations and people and his company Akamai Technologies and their foundation who also have done wonderful work in letting people know about this story.
Thank you for that, Marco. I want to share with all of you a short video of Danny before we resuming our Q&A with Marco.
Major explosion is what appears to be a complete collapse. This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see
I still get the chills and tear up and get emotional, but I think it's more than that, and it's emotion that maybe isn't very politically correct, but I know that Danny and many others have of being angry, of wanting to seek justice. That's certainly a Jewish value in terms of justice, and
Well,
I woke up today and I thanked one of the brave members of the U.S. military who was sent to Iraq and Afghanistan on multiple tours. His name is Stephen Value. He might be listening in, and he was shot in the back dismantling a bomb. And he's in a wheelchair. He's paraplegic. It doesn't stop him from jumping out of airplanes and teaching fellow disabled vets how to ski. And I think in this world where our memory is very short, that it's also an opportunity to remember those who gave their lives, who came back maimed and injured, not just from the US military, but from Canada, from Europe, from all over the world. And I think Danny would be one of the first to thank them. So I got up this morning, and the first thing I did is I said to Stephen, Danny's thanking you from heaven. Okay.
So September 11th opened a wound in America that has never fully healed. What do you think Danny's vision might have been for a post 9/11 world?
As I indicated, Danny was a proud Israeli American. He was born in Denver, Colorado. He was there until he was 14 years old. He came back, and it wasn't an easy decision once you make Aliyah to come back even temporarily to the States. He did that obviously very successfully. I think Danny would want an America that is strong militarily, but is also strong in terms of its democratic values. We didn't always see eye to eye politically. When I lived in Israel in 1996, Danny poked fun at me for being naive, for voting for Shimon Peres, and he voted for Bibi Netanyahu. And I think the more things have changed, the more they stay the same. And it turns out that both their visions, in a way, were fulfilled of these political leaders, especially as we're seeing El Al flights land in the UAE. That sounds very much Shimon Peres like the New Middle East, but also the pragmatism of Bibi Netanyahu in terms of a strong Israel, secure Israel, have come through loud and clear. Danny would certainly be someone who would support efforts for diversity and inclusion, which is an understandable rallying cry around those protests against racial injustice. He would, however, indicate that diversity comes in all forms, and it also includes diversity of thought. And being able to have a respectful yet constructive argument in which we can say to the other party, "At lo tzodeket v'ani asbir lach lama." You are not correct, and I'm going to explain to you why. Danny was very much a fan of wrestling, both physically and intellectually, with people, but moreover with big ideas. And one of the casualties sometimes of the current incredibly politically correct environment is that we are all walking on eggshells, afraid of offending, afraid of taking ownership. And although Danny had no business training, his training as an officer in the IDF, combined with his academic training, combined with his personality, he was a born leader. He didn't need an MBA to lead his colleagues to, become one of the most successful IPOs of all time. And to this day, an S&P 500 company, he'd be smiling at all the success. He was someone who was driven by intellectual curiosity and self-motivation. As an example, he used to tell me about his theories of not theory and his theories of infinity, which were hard for me to understand as someone who failed geometry. Well, actually, I passed geometry. I failed trigonometry in high school, and somehow I still got into UC Berkeley. So we were very different in many ways. I was honored to be among his closest friends. I can say this to your audience, but Danny signed the ketubah at my wedding in 1998. He held up the chuppah, but he did something else that's even more remarkable. When I told him that I have my girlfriend I want to introduce him to, who I've known all of 6 weeks, and she's pregnant, he said, I think that's great. You're going to be a great dad. I can't wait to meet Stacy. Well, guys, that was 23 years ago and 3 kids later, and we're happily married. So this was someone who was able to rely on their instinct, on their innate gut as a compass. Yes, doing the due diligence. Yes, looking at the facts. He was a scientist. But it's also trusting from above and trusting ourselves and listening to our bodies and our hearts and our souls about what is right. And I'm proud that I've dedicated a book published by Hachette that came out a few months ago at the height of COVID, at the height of civil unrest, called Primitive, Tapping the Primal Drive That Powers the World's Most Successful People. And what I saw in Danny was a real life case study for me about how many of the most successful people in business that we've read about, heard about, and certainly several that I've had the good fortune to work with, throw out the civilized rule book and march to their own drum.
Tell us how your new book captured Danny's essence and how you think each of us can carry its essence in all of our affairs.
Right. Okay. So I say in the book, Danny was an uber primitive. And by the way, when I say the word primitive, I'm reclaiming what I know is a loaded word, but I mean it in the most positive, pure sense. Think of nature. Think of children. Think of animals. We have a primitive brain. We have a cerebral civilized brain. MIT scientists did research over a decade ago showing that maybe we're not giving the primitive part of our brain, that's which is fast, emotive, nimble, enough credit. And so that was very much an impetus for this book. It's a little bit business book. It's a little bit motivation, a little bit self-help, career with some memoir sprinkled on top. And Danny is my poster boy, if I can use that term, for a chapter called Oppositional, the ability to oppose others in a constructive way in order to carry us all up to a higher and more productive place. The acronym that I use for the book, I call roaming, and I'll just go, Tal, very quickly through what that stands and explain why Danny deserves checks in all those boxes. Is that okay?
Of course.
And next time we're going to have Akamai stream everything that Momentum does, so there are no technical glitches. Relentless is R. It doesn't just mean working hard. It also means sometimes having a bit of a chip on your shoulder, sometimes taking things personally, and not waiting till your name is called or until you go to the head of the queue, but sometimes jumping in line. Danny did all that and more. Oh, we talked about in terms of being oppositional. There's a section in my book in which Danny challenges the then head of Enron, one of the biggest high flyers in Internet 1.0, on a fundamental concept that he had, and he called Jeff Skilling, who parentheses later went to prison, Jeff, you're wrong, you wasted my time, I'm flying back. Agnostic. Danny had the ability to jump from field to field, area to area. He was both the best salesperson in the company, the best marketer, the best chief technology officer, the best investor relations executive, the best HR recruiter. He could do it all. In today's world, we often stick into our silos too much. Danny jumped between silos. He didn't believe in such a thing. M is messianic, and that was big time Danny. And no, I'm not talking about certain cults that I won't even name that distort our faith. I'm talking about having a divine purpose. What is your mission? what is the first thing you think about in the morning and the last thing as your head hits the pillow? And for Danny, it was certainly his love of Akamai technologies and transforming the internet. I was insecure, right? Although Danny was confident, there were times when he confided in me, he tossed and turned at night about a certain paper he wrote or about an interaction with a boss. Incidentally, I forgot to mention that when he was at the Technion, he also was a researcher at MIT, at IBM, excuse me, before MIT. So Danny embraced the notion of the sukkah being impermanent, that our existence is by definition insecure. He embodied that. N in the Roman acronym is for nuts, which means crazy in a good kind of way. He was eccentric. He was out there. He signed off his email with his signature, "You're behind." So he pushed the envelopes. And finally, G, he was gallant. I'm not going to play the rabbi here. And I'm not a native Hebrew speaker, but I picked it up. And Danny had an accent, although his Hebrew was much better than mine. And I certainly have an American accent that is volet, as we say. It's very pronounced. But I'll say a word, achrayut. Comes from the Shoresh, as you know, acher, the other. So gallant primitives are those who truly care about the other. They put the other before themselves. And I recount in my book times that I was, yes, depressed, and Danny would come down to New York City to lift my spirits. But not just me. He'd visit his aunt, who he loved dearly, who was single and a school teacher in the New York City public schools. He definitely thought about the other, and right before he was murdered on 9/11, he was grappling with colleagues at Akamai, including his best friend and co-founder of the company and professor at MIT, Tom Layton, not to lay off people, because they were engaged in a reduction in force. So Danny didn't just have an incredible intellect, he also had heart and soul. And a lot of that heart and soul and humanity and concern from the other is not as evident in the business world or in the political world as it need be. So he would certainly be very troubled by how America is torn today and hope that the country can heal, as we all do.